Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Case studies of critical race theory in discourse analysis. The examination of critical race theory, CRT, through discourse analysis provides a revealing lens into how racial issues are interwoven within the fabric of society's communications and structures. This analysis becomes particularly compelling when exploring case studies by prominent scholars such as Kimberlé Crenshaw, Derek Bell, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, Toon A. Van Dyke, and Philomena Est. Each offers unique insights into the mechanisms of racism and discrimination through the study of intersectionality, fictional allegories, color-blind ideologies, elite influences, and the mundanities of everyday racism. These case studies not only deepen our understanding of systemic discrimination but also highlight the transformative potential of discourse analysis in challenging and reshaping the prevailing narratives around race and identity in various spheres of life. 1. Kimberlé Crenshaw on intersectionality. Kimberlé Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality is pivotal in understanding how overlapping social identities relate to systems of oppression and discrimination. In discourse analysis, particularly through the lens of critical race theory, CRT, her work illuminates the complexities of how race and gender intersect within legal narratives and other forms of discourse. By examining Crenshaw's application of intersectionality in her case studies, we can see a profound methodological and analytical approach that enriches our understanding of discourse. 1. Case study analysis. Intersectionality in legal narratives. Deconstructing legal language. Crenshaw's work often explores how legal language and narratives fail to recognize the specific experiences of Black women, treating race and gender as mutually exclusive categories. In discourse analysis, this examination reveals how certain narratives perpetuate exclusion and inequality. For instance, legal proceedings and documents may systematically ignore the compounded discrimination faced by Black women, simplifying complex interplays of identity into singular issue cases. Exploring judicial decisions. Crenshaw analyzes several key cases in her discussions of intersectionality. One notable example is Degra-Finride v. General Motors, where the court dismissed a discrimination lawsuit filed by 5 Black women, stating that the anti-discrimination law did not recognize Black women as a special class protected from discrimination based on both race and gender. This case study in discourse analysis shows how the language used in judicial decisions can reflect and reinforce institutional biases, effectively erasing the unique experiences of intersecting identities. Media representation and public discourse. Beyond legal texts, Crenshaw extends her analysis to media representations and public discourse, noting how these platforms shape and are shaped by racial and gender biases. Her examination includes looking at how stories are told about race and gender, what is included and what is omitted, and whose voices are heard or silenced. For example, the portrayal of African American women in media often follows stereotypical narratives that do not reflect the true diversity and complexity of their experiences. Policy implications and advocacy. Crenshaw's work also provides a critical foundation for advocating policy changes. By revealing the gaps in how existing policies address the needs of those with intersecting identities, she paves the way for more inclusive approaches. This aspect of discourse analysis can be instrumental in developing policies that more effectively address the realities of discrimination faced by individuals at the intersection of multiple identities. 2. Implications for discourse analysis. Crenshaw's integration of intersectionality in examining legal and public narratives provides a comprehensive framework that can be utilized in various fields of discourse analysis. By highlighting the limitations of viewing identity and oppression through a single-axis framework, she encourages a more nuanced examination of how power and privilege operate across different dimensions of identity. This approach not only broadens the analytical scope of discourse analysis but also enhances its practical implications in addressing and dismantling systemic discrimination. It prompts a re-evaluation of how narratives are constructed and the impact they have on perpetuating or challenging social inequalities. In summary, Kimberlé Crenshaw's case studies using intersectionality in critical race theory offer profound insights into the interconnectedness of race and gender in discourse. These studies serve as a critical tool in discourse analysis, providing a robust model for examining, understanding, and challenging the complex layers of discrimination and privilege in societal narratives. 2. Derek Bell's Space Traders. Derek Bell's Space Traders provides a provocative and imaginative scenario used to critique American racial politics through a fictional lens, making it a rich case study for analysis within the framework of critical race theory, CRT, in discourse analysis. This allegorical tale is part of Bell's larger endeavor to explore and expose the enduring nature of racism in America, especially the structural and systemic forms that it takes. 1. Overview of Space Traders. In Space Traders, Derek Bell imagines a scenario where aliens visit Earth and offer the United States a wealth of valuable resources in exchange for all of its black citizens. The story is set in a context where this proposal is seriously considered and eventually accepted by the U.S. government, highlighting the expendability and marginalization of African Americans within the political and social spheres of the country. 2. Discourse analysis of Space Traders. Narrative structure and symbolism. The narrative structure of Space Traders utilizes symbolism heavily, with the aliens representing an external yet reflective view of American values and priorities. In discourse analysis, this fictional setup allows for an exploration of how narratives about trade, value, and worth are constructed and the racial undertones that often underpin them. The story critiques the commodification of black bodies that historically undergirds American economic and social systems. Public and political discourse. Bell's story provides a stark lens through which to view the mechanics of public and political discourse surrounding race. The negotiations and discussions among politicians, citizens, and media in the story mirror real-world discourses that shape racial policy and public opinion. Analyzing this discourse reveals how arguments and ideologies concerning race are framed, such as the utilitarian logic often employed to justify systemic racism. Ethical and moral reflections. Space Traders forces readers and analysts to confront uncomfortable ethical and moral questions about societal values. Discourse analysis here can delve into the narrative techniques Bell uses to challenge readers to reflect on what sacrifices are made at the altar of economic and national interests, and how these sacrifices are justified within the narrative, paralleling justifications in real-world discourse. Impact on racial consciousness. By creating a fictional yet plausible scenario, Bell stimulates a critical examination of racial consciousness in America. The extreme nature of his premise serves to strip down complex issues to their core, revealing the underlying truths about societal and systemic racial inequalities. This aspect of discourse analysis can be used to understand how hypothetical scenarios can be employed effectively in critical race discussions to illuminate and critique existing racial dynamics. 3. Implications for discourse analysis. Space Traders serves as a metaphorical and critical examination of America's deeply ingrained racial issues, providing discourse analysts with a tool to unpack how fictional narratives reflect and influence societal beliefs and behaviors about race. The story invites an introspective look at how racism is embedded in societal structures and the often uncomfortable truths about the value assigned to different racial groups. Through a critical race theoretical lens, Bell's narrative becomes a powerful commentary on and critique of racial politics, offering insights into the ways narratives can be constructed, understood, and challenged in the discourse surrounding race in America. Analyzing Space Traders allows for a deeper understanding of the narrative's impact on discussions about race, revealing the potential of speculative fiction as a medium for critical social examination and discourse. 3. Eduardo Bonilla Silva's analysis of color-blind racism. Eduardo Bonilla Silva's analysis of color-blind racism is a significant contribution to the field of critical race theory, CRT, and provides an essential framework for understanding how contemporary forms of racism are manifested in both public and private discourses. His work specifically critiques the ideology of color blindness, which purports to ignore race as a way to end racism, arguing instead that such an approach actually perpetuates racial inequality by obscuring the structural and institutional dynamics that maintain racial hierarchies. 1. Bonilla Silva's concept of color-blind racism. Bonilla Silva argues that color-blind racism is the prevailing racial ideology in the United States in the post-civil rights era. Unlike overt, old-fashioned racism, color-blind racism subtly promotes racial inequalities by ignoring racial identities and issues, under the guise of treating everyone equally, without regard to race. Bonilla Silva identifies several discursive strategies that people use to express color-blind racial ideologies, which he categorizes into frames. Abstract liberalism, using ideas associated with political liberalism and economic liberalism, such as equal opportunity and choice, in an abstract manner to explain racial matters. Naturalization, explaining racial phenomena as if they were natural occurrences, like self-segregation in neighborhoods and schools, as people wanting to be with their own kind. Cultural racism, relying on culturally based arguments such as minorities not valuing education or poor work ethics to explain the social standing of minority groups. Minimization of racism, downplaying the role of racial discrimination in affecting the lives and opportunities of people of color. 2. Analysis of public and private discourses. Public discourse. In the public arena, color-blind ideologies manifest in political rhetoric, policy discussions, and public debates. For instance, policies that do not explicitly acknowledge race but have racially disparate impacts, like voter ID laws or at-large voting systems, can be analyzed using Bonilla Silva's framework. His analysis provides tools for revealing how racial inequality is reproduced by ostensibly neutral or fair policies and practices. Private discourse. In private conversations, color-blind racism appears in the way individuals talk about race without acknowledging its impact on inequality. For example, when discussing employment or education, people might attribute disparities to anything but race, such as economic status or individual effort, thereby ignoring the systemic factors that contribute to racial inequities. 3. Implications for discourse analysis. Analyzing discourses through Bonilla Silva's lens of color-blind racism enables researchers and theorists to uncover the subtle and not-so-subtle ways racism is embedded in everyday language and interactions. It shows how individuals and institutions can perpetuate racial inequalities, even when they claim to be non-racist. This approach is crucial for discourse analysts because it provides a methodological tool to decode the complexities of modern racism embedded in the fabric of society's communications. Eduardo Bonilla Silva's analysis of color-blind racism challenges the discourse community to rethink how race is addressed in society. It urges a move away from a simplistic understanding of racism as merely prejudice or individual acts of discrimination to a more complex understanding of systemic and structural issues. By examining how color-blind ideologies permeate various discourses, Bonilla Silva's work is pivotal in articulating how discourse shapes and maintains the social structures that govern racial dynamics, making it an essential study for anyone engaged in the critical analysis of race and racism within discourse analysis. 4. Toon A. Van Dijk's studies on elite racism. Toon A. Van Dijk's work on elite racism provides a crucial perspective in the field of discourse analysis, particularly within the framework of critical race theory, CRT. His research focuses on how elite groups, such as politicians, media professionals, and corporate leaders, control and shape public discourse on race and racism. Van Dijk's studies reveal how these influential figures and institutions play a pivotal role in perpetuating racial inequalities through the management of societal narratives. 1. Core concepts of Van Dijk's studies on elite racism. Van Dijk introduces the concept of elite racism to describe the subtle and often institutionalized forms of racism that are propagated by society's most influential members. He emphasizes the role of discourse in this process, illustrating how language and communication practices are tools used by elites to maintain control over societal perceptions and beliefs about race. Control of public discourse. Elites have access to and control over major communication platforms, such as mainstream media, academic publications, and legislative bodies. This control allows them to shape public discourse in ways that reflect and reinforce their interests and worldview, often at the expense of racial minorities. Van Dijk's analysis includes studying speech acts, news reporting styles, editorial decisions, and public policy discussions to uncover the linguistic and rhetorical strategies used to influence public opinion on race-related issues. Reproduction of racial ideologies. Through discourse, elites can reproduce existing racial ideologies or introduce new ones. Van Dijk's research shows how racial prejudices and stereotypes are embedded in the narratives that elites produce and propagate. For example, the depiction of racial minorities in the media often follows stereotypical or negative frames, influencing public perceptions and attitudes subtly but powerfully. Gatekeeping information. Elites act as gatekeepers of information, deciding what news gets attention and how it is presented. This gatekeeping role extends to which topics are considered newsworthy and how issues related to race are framed. Van Dijk points out that such control can lead to a biased presentation of events and issues, which may minimize the significance of racism or misrepresent the experiences of racial minorities. Legitimization of social inequalities. By controlling discourse, elites not only shape how race and racism are perceived but also legitimize the existing social and racial order. Van Dijk examines how elites use discourse to justify social inequalities under the guise of natural differences, meritocracy, or national interest, thereby normalizing and rationalizing systemic racism. 2. Implications for discourse analysis. Van Dijk's studies are fundamental in understanding the intersection of power, discourse, and racism. They provide discourse analysts with the tools to dissect how power relations influence the construction of racial narratives and the broader social implications of these narratives. By examining the strategies and impacts of elite racism, researchers can uncover the underlying mechanisms through which racial ideologies are perpetuated and challenged within public and private spheres. This approach is critical for unpacking the complexities of racism in modern societies, where overt racial discrimination has been replaced by more covert and systemic forms. Van Dijk's exploration of elite racism enriches the discourse analysis in critical race theory by highlighting the significant role of societal elites in shaping and sustaining racial discourses. His work encourages a critical examination of not only the content of public discourses on race but also the structures and processes through which these discourses are produced and maintained. Understanding these dynamics is essential for anyone engaged in the critical study of language, power, and racism. 5. Philomena Essed's work on everyday racism. Philomena Essed's work on everyday racism is a cornerstone in understanding how racism is experienced and perpetuated in daily life, particularly through mundane interactions and seemingly benign practices. Her research has profoundly impacted critical race theory, CRT, and discourse analysis by highlighting how racism is embedded in the routine practices of social life, making it repetitive, familiar, and normalized. Essed's work provides a framework for analyzing how these daily occurrences contribute to the larger structure of racism in society. 1. Core concepts of Philomena Essed's work on everyday racism. Est introduces the concept of everyday racism to describe how racial oppression is experienced in ordinary, often unnoticed, ways in the day-to-day lives of people of color. This form of racism is not about isolated incidents but is systemic, ingrained in the fabric of everyday interactions and institutional practices. She emphasizes that understanding everyday racism requires recognizing the subtle and normalized forms of discrimination that are deeply integrated into social structures and behaviors. Repetitiveness. Everyday racism is characterized by its repetitive nature. People of color encounter similar types of discrimination over and over again, which reinforces the normalcy of these experiences. For instance, being repeatedly subjected to heightened scrutiny in stores or being consistently overlooked for promotions at work are examples of how racism manifests in routine practices. Familiarity. The familiarity of everyday racism means that these practices are well known and expected by those who experience them. This familiarity also makes it challenging for individuals who do not experience these patterns to see or understand them as forms of racism. Essed's analysis helps to elucidate these familiar interactions, revealing their racist underpinnings to a broader audience. Normalization. everyday racism is normalized through its integration into common social practices and institutions. This normalization means that such practices are often invisibilized and taken for granted by the dominant group. Est points out that normalization allows racism to be sustained and perpetuated without being recognized or addressed effectively by society. 2. Analyzing discourse and everyday racism. Micro-level interactions. In her analysis, Est focuses on the micro-level interactions that occur in everyday settings, such as workplaces, educational institutions, and public spaces, and how these interactions reproduce racial inequalities. By examining language, conversational tactics, and interactional routines, Est demonstrates how racial prejudices are communicated and maintained subtly within everyday conversations. Institutional practices. Est also extends her analysis to institutional practices that reflect and reinforce everyday racism. This includes policies and procedures that may not explicitly mention race but have racially discriminatory outcomes. For example, school disciplinary actions that disproportionately affect students of color, or housing policies that indirectly segregate neighborhoods, are scrutinized under her analytical lens. 3. Implications for discourse analysis. Philomena Esad's work invites discourse analysts to consider the pervasive impact of routine, normalized interactions in perpetuating racial bias and inequality. It challenges researchers to identify and critique the discrete yet powerful ways racism is embedded in everyday language and social practices. Her framework encourages a deeper investigation into how societal structures and individual behaviors interact to maintain racial hierarchies. Philomena Esad's exploration of everyday racism is instrumental in shedding light on the ordinary and often overlooked aspects of racial discrimination. Her approach enriches the discourse analysis within critical race theory by providing a nuanced understanding of how racism is woven into the very fabric of daily life, urging a meticulous and critical examination of everyday interactions and institutional practices. This perspective is vital for anyone committed to addressing and dismantling systemic racism at both the micro and macro levels of society. Conclusion. Through these critical examinations of race and discourse, scholars like Crenshaw, Bell, Bonilla Silva, Van Dyke, and Est equip us with a robust analytical toolkit for understanding and dismantling systemic racism. Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, Bell's allegorical critiques, Bonilla Silva's insights into color-blind racism, Van Dyke's studies on elite racism, and Esad's exploration of everyday racism, collectively illuminate the pervasive and nuanced ways in which racism is perpetuated. By applying CRT within discourse analysis, these studies encourage a re-evaluation of societal narratives and legal frameworks, advocating for a more equitable society. The critical discourse analysis of these scholars not only provides profound theoretical insights but also urges actionable changes in policies and social consciousness, making it an indispensable resource for both academics and policymakers aiming to foster racial equality. Frequently asked questions. How does Kimberlé Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality apply to discourse analysis? In discourse analysis, Crenshaw's intersectionality is used to examine how race and gender intersect in legal narratives, highlighting how multiple forms of oppression are constructed and maintained in discourse, and how these intersections influence policy and social perceptions. What insights does Derek Bell's Space Traders offer to discourse analysts? Bell's Space Traders provides a narrative framework for analyzing racial politics and public discourse. It challenges analysts to explore how fictional narratives reflect societal values and racial biases, and how these narratives influence real-world racial attitudes and policies. How does Eduardo Bonilla Silva's concept of color-blind racism inform discourse analysis? Bonilla Silva's concept helps discourse analysts identify how racial issues are subtly addressed or obscured in everyday language, policy debates, and media, showing how racism persists in forms that claim to ignore race, thus perpetuating inequality through ostensibly neutral discourses. In what ways does Toon A. Van Dyke's work on elite racism contribute to discourse analysis? Van Dyke's analysis of elite racism reveals how societal elites manipulate discourse to maintain racial inequalities. His work prompts discourse analysts to study the control of media narratives, policy framing, and public discourse, examining how these practices shape societal understanding of race. What does Philomena Esad's Everyday Racism reveal about racial dynamics in discourse analysis? Esad's concept of everyday racism is pivotal for analyzing the subtleties of how racism is embedded in routine social interactions and institutional communications. It helps analysts see how racial discrimination is normalized and perpetuated through commonplace language and behaviors. How can intersectionality enhance the analysis of media narratives? By applying intersectionality, discourse analysts can better understand how media narratives either reinforce or challenge multiple, overlapping forms of oppression, providing a more nuanced analysis of how identities and experiences are represented in media. What methodological approaches are inspired by Derek Bell's narratives for analyzing racial discourse? Bell's use of allegorical narratives encourages the use of similar methodologies in discourse analysis, such as narrative analysis, which involves examining how stories about race and identity are constructed in various media and what these stories reveal about underlying societal norms and values. How does understanding color-blind racism help in analyzing political discourse? Analyzing political discourse through the lens of color-blind racism allows analysts to uncover how policies and political rhetoric subtly promote racial disparities while ostensibly promoting racial equality, revealing the complexities of modern racial issues. How can Toon A. Van Dyke's studies impact the analysis of racial representations in the news? Van Dyke's work can guide analysts to explore how news media constructs racial others and maintains power structures through language, focusing on how news narratives serve the interests of elite groups and maintain societal status quos. How can educators use Philomena Esad's Everyday Racism to address racial biases in educational materials? Educators and discourse analysts can use Esad's insights to critically review educational materials and classroom discourse for subtle racial biases and stereotypes, helping to develop more inclusive educational practices that reflect the realities of all students.